Hey. No. Hey. Hey. All right. It's great to be here. Today, my talk is going to be focused on how Black Power is transforming democracy. But yet, I had to make a confession, which is that I'm also very much a proud member of the domestic worker movement. And I currently serve as the Special Projects Director for the National Domestic Workers Alliance, in addition to my role at the Black Lives Matter Network. We in the domestic worker movement are very excited to be back here at PDF. And it was on this very stage last year that my colleague and friend Palak Shah drew the connections between domestic workers and gig workers. And so since then, we've been building bridges between our social movements and tech companies, and I'm excited for you this afternoon to hear from Anand Kulkarni, who is going to talk a little bit more about how tech and labor can collaborate to build a movement for good work. You might be asking yourselves, what does that have to do with Black Lives Matter? But I'm going to tell you, Black Lives Matter is about transforming our economy and transforming our democracy. And so again, I hope you get a chance to look at that talk a little bit later today. When I was in high school, I was required to take a civics class. Anybody else here required to take a civics class? And it was there that I learned about my responsibilities as a citizen of the United States. My civics class taught me about how our system of democracy works, and it taught me about where it came from, how it got developed. It taught me that my citizenship was a privilege that was earned only by participation. And yet, what my civics class did not teach me was that my citizenship is conditional. This is the harsh reality for Black people in America. We are expected to participate in democracy without receiving the full benefits of democracy. Now, increasingly, democracy is hard to define, right? We throw that word around all the time, and so I'm going to attempt to give what I think a definition of democracy is, especially in today's political context. Not everybody agrees on what democracy is, but one thing that I hope we can all agree on is that democracy has continuously excluded Black people. For our purposes today, I want to talk about democracy as having 4 key characteristics. So one is that democracy requires a political system for selecting and replacing our practices of governance and the people who are governing. 2, democracy requires the active participation of all people in that place, as citizens in politics and also as citizens in civic life. And then 3rd, democracy requires protection of the human rights of all citizens. And then, of course, lastly, democracy requires that the laws and procedures of wherever it is that you are apply equally to everyone. But let's take a minute to take a look at the state of our democracy. In 2005, Black people, many of them poor, waved white t-shirts on tops of roofs in the Gulf Coast, waiting for relief that never came, even today. Stuffed in stadiums, abandoned in jails, shot as we tried to cross bridges to find safety. We were called looters and rioters, while white families were called finders and survivors. 2005 was also the year that Stanley Tookie Williams was executed in the prison that my mother was a corrections officer at. In 2009, Oscar Grant was shot on a BART station platform. BART is our public transportation system. It's our above-ground subway. Just 3 blocks from my house on New Year's Day. Oscar's last words were, "You shot me, I got a daughter." His daughter, Tatiana, is now an 11-year-old girl, living with the legacy of her father, who has now become an icon for all the wrong reasons, murdered when she was just 4 years old. In 2011, an innocent man named Troy Davis was put to death in Georgia. In 2012, Jordan Davis was killed in Jacksonville, Florida for playing his music too loud in a gas station. His killer immediately afterwards went home and ate pizza with his girlfriend. That same year, Cece McDonald was jailed for defending herself against a racist and transphobic attacker. Rekia Boyd in Chicago was shot and killed that year by police. In 2013, George Zimmerman was acquitted in the murder of Trayvon Martin. 2013 was also the year that 19-year-old Renisha McBride was shot in the eye on the porch of a man's house after she'd gone there to ask for help. In August of 2014, Michael Brown was murdered just steps from his mother's home in Ferguson, Missouri. And then just 2 months later, 12-year-old Tamir Rice, yes, I said 12 years old, was shot and killed by Cleveland police officers while playing alone in a park. You see, we've been living in an era where everything and nothing is about race, where explanations of the events that I just described are often cast aside as the result of a few bad apples or a glitch in the system, the unfortunate consequences of what happens to people who don't try hard enough or don't work hard enough. But we emerge from an era where talking about race and racial inequity has been deemed racist in and of itself. Even Rodney King, whose brutal beating by the Los Angeles Police Department in 1992, and it was one of the first to be caught on videotape and broadcast around the world, even Rodney King responded to the rage that many poor Black and brown people felt by saying, "Can we all just get along?" As if it was just as simple as people being nicer to each other. There's a cauldron that has been bubbling under the surface for a very, very long time, occasionally expressing itself in instances of uprising, but none as sustained as what we see today. Indeed, the last 10 years of post-racialism and the neoliberal assault on Black communities has prompted a beautiful upsurge in Black resistance. Resistance which has resulted in the beginnings of a new political order. It has also forced us as a nation to question and imagine and begin to build what a real democracy can and should look like. Now, each year, more than 1,000 fatal shootings occur by on-duty police officers. And each year, less than 5 of those shootings, on average, result in a charge of murder or manslaughter against those who commit the crime. In the last few years, that number has tripled, and it is still nowhere near close to enough, the resistance and the victories that have been won, but let me tell you, it would not be happening at all were it not for the organizing and the disruptions of the past few years. Were it not for the months of organizing and direct action in Oakland, Oscar Grant's killer would not have been charged, nor would he have been convicted. And in fact, what I hear is that he's one of the first officers ever to be convicted in the state of California, my home state. Were it not for the organizing efforts in Dearborn Heights, Michigan, led by Black women, Ted Wafer would not have been charged with the shooting and the murder of Renisha McBride, nor would he have been convicted. Were it not for the courage and tenacity of young people who occupied the state capitol in Florida for 31 days and 30 nights, demanding an end to stand your ground laws after George Zimmerman was acquitted, many of us would not have known that the laws that are designed to uproot structural racism would have been under continuous assault by the types of laws that give vigilantes the power to be judge, jury, and executioner. Were it not for the community of Ferguson, Missouri, who refused to go home and let the system work, Darren Wilson would still be patrolling that community, and the corrupt nature of policing and debtors' prisons built off the backs of poor people there would still be in effect. Were it not for the years of organizing in Chicago to fire the officer who killed Rekia Boyd, to expose the collusion between the mayor and the prosecutor, we wouldn't have seen the recent unseating of Anita Alvarez, complicit in the cover-up of the murder of Laquan McDonald, shot 16 times in the back by Chicago police. Were it not for the organizing that did not get national attention, Prosecutor Timothy McGinty, who refused to bring charges against the officers who killed an unarmed 12-year-old, yes, an unarmed 12-year-old, that prosecutor would still have a job. He would still be deciding the fates of many. Black people, Black resistance, and Black organizing has changed the landscape of what is politically possible today. Whether you call it Black Lives Matter, whether or not you put a hashtag in front of it, or whether you call it the Movement for Black Lives, it's irrelevant. Because there was resistance before Black Lives Matter, and if we do our jobs right, there will be resistance after Black Lives Matter. What is important for us to acknowledge is that Black people today are determined to transform democracy, to make the impossible possible. And what is important to acknowledge is that that work will not, cannot, and must not be credited to any political party. When we say no more business as usual, it's an indicator that we aim to transform this democracy into something that supports all of us, not just some of us. Black folks have been at the center of the fight to force this country to live up to the values and ideals that it espouses, the very ideals that underpin our version of democracy. From Nat Turner's revolt to Sojourner Truth's "Ain't I a Woman" speech to white suffragettes to Fannie Lou Hamer being sick and tired of being sick and tired and calling for independent Black political power, Black resistance and Black organizing has consistently shaped the way that we understand and experience civic participation. Black folks have consistently been denied access to the rights and privileges of citizenship that so many of us take for granted. And that's why so many of us are no longer content with private meetings and negotiations that happen behind the scenes, which leave out too many people whose lives depend on the ability to participate in the decisions that impact their lives. So many of us are no longer content with the same old tactics devoid of a larger strategy that stares transformation directly in the face. What is possible in policy and politics has been facilitated in large part by Black organizing and Black resistance. It is a resistance that challenges the notion of going along to get along, a resistance that is in dynamic tension with the notion that only policy change will get us to where we are trying to go, and that calls us all to the mat to live the values that we espouse. It is a resistance that says, no, we are not happy with the lesser of two evils. We are not satisfied with the process as it stands. And this generation says that we are not satisfied with the crumbs that may fall from the table of power. And we are not satisfied with merely sitting at the tables of power. In fact, we aim to up and overturn those tables in favor of a new system overall. This generation says, we will transform the way that power is distributed. We will transform the way that power functions, and we aim for a new kind of power that is in collaboration rather than in competition. Our generation says that we will exercise power with rather than power over. This generation says we are not scared of what it means to take power. This generation understands that to enact meaningful policy change, we must equally value the role that culture change plays. Said more simply, the battle to win hearts and minds does not happen at the policy table. It is the work that is necessary to ready the ground for new agreements about how we interact with one another. Now, the last few years has given us lots to consider about how change happens, what type of change we seek, and what gets in the way of us obtaining the type of change we deserve. To be clear, this movement is not just engaged in an external struggle, but also in an internal one as we seek to clarify what is it that we stand for and what is it that we stand against. We too are navigating the tension between allowing 1,000 flowers to bloom while at the same time distinguishing between what are flowers and what are in fact weeds that threaten to consume the entire ecosystem. From my perspective, there's 3 critical lessons that we've learned about how democracy is transformed. First lesson, organizing works. And we must remain clear that organizing and protest are not the same thing. Protest is an important tactic that raises the stakes, but it will not accomplish all the change that we seek. The hard work of building a base that is an ongoing dialogue with one another cannot and must not be underestimated. And it is the work of building relationships across difference for the sake of transformation, for the sake of our collective liberation. It is the work of placing sustained and escalating pressure upon those who refuse us access to the decisions that impact our lives. And it is the work of aligning ourselves deliberately with others in motion to create a more coherent whole. It is the work of talking to more people than those who agree with us. The work of organizing has been distorted in the age of social media. And yet, while it's possible to move thousands of people online to accomplish a task, and it's even possible to have hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter, it is not, unfortunately, what is sufficient or required for long-term movement building. Our online presence is not the totality of who we are. In fact, our online presence is really the way that we like to project ourselves. Our carefully curated projections are no match for the nuance and hard work that movement building requires. A 3-dimensional organizing model is what's needed, knowing that each of us exist at the intersections of many different experiences. And it's those experiences that will help us unlock the potential of what a new world can and should look like. Those of us who seek to upset the table of power cannot continue to assert that disruption is somehow destructive to the aims that we seek. Let me say that again. You can't be for social change and against disruption. Frederick Douglass said this to us in 1857. He said, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one. And it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Disruption is the new world order. It is the way that those denied power assert power. And in the context of a larger strategy for how to contend for power, disruption is an important way to surface new opportunities. Finally, I'd like to foreshadow and remind us that movements are not reserved solely for those of us who identify on the left. For more than 30 years, many of us have been contending with a powerful movement that has left a lasting impression on every aspect of our society. And that movement has worked diligently to unravel many of the gains that my ancestors, my family, my community, and your community has fought so hard for. It is a movement that aims to rewrite history in order to determine the future, a movement that has had enormous implications for many. That movement has offered us valuable lessons about what it means to maintain coalitions and alliances of groups of people who do not agree on how to get where we're going, but certainly agree on where they'd like to end up. They've taught us about the kinds of power that are necessary to reshape our society. Narrative power, disruptive power, political power, economic power, in coordination with each other, they matter. I'll be honest with you, I'm terrified about the current and eventual impacts of that movement. It's a movement that seeks to deny many of us our fundamental humanity. What we know today is that a new way of organizing, connecting across difference, articulating our values of what we stand for and what we will no longer stand for is imperative if we are to have a new democracy. This is no longer about ideology or, worse yet, political parties. We know that, right? Because neither Democrats or Republicans have been able to stop the tide of frustration and disillusionment and hatred that is washing over this country. So that's why it's up to us to take seriously the task of moving differently. We can no longer afford to congratulate ourselves, especially those of us who self-identify as progressives, when there's a backlash against us and we are largely non-responsive or responding in ways that are ineffective and dangerous. You cannot tell communities who bear the brunt of racist violence in this country to vote for the Democratic Party, and you cannot tell us that the Republican Party is the only one buoyed by racism. It's unfair, it's untrue, and it's disingenuous. Today's Black power is transforming democracy, but we can't do it alone. We need the best and the brightest thinkers, strategists, surveillance experts, tech geeks, and disruptors to utilize all the tools that we have available to us to build the world that we want to see. A world where Black lives matter, a world where all lives matter, a world where we can finally say that we dared to dream, we dared to struggle, and because we dared, we won. Thank you.